In this lesson, what I want to do is talk about a further sociological theory, or a sociological practice, if you will, and that is that of feminism. So we began by looking at functionalism, we then continued looking at Marxist theories of sociology, and now let's have a look at some feminist theories of sociology. We're going to introduce what feminism generally is all about, and then we'll talk about a number of different types of feminist sociological theories that we can digest. So, as an introduction, a feminist and feminism is the argument that inherently society is what we call patriarchal. Now, this is a key term that you probably need to learn. And this means that it's a system of society where men hold power and that women are largely excluded from this dynamic. So a patriarchal society is one in which men are the ones who hold power and women are largely excluded. Okay, now that's just a general idea of what patriarchy or a patriarchal society really is about. And you can probably get from that the kinds of sociological theories that will exist within feminism from just understanding what patriarchy refers to. And this can bring up a number of different policy prescriptions within a feminist, through a feminist lens. And it suggests that according to feminism, societal inequalities are based around gender, based around men and women, or to an extent largely based. So we have a situation where when we see societal inequalities, they tend to exist along the dimension of men versus women. Men will be earning more money, men will be holding the top jobs and the top positions within society, men will inherit wealth at a higher rate than women, and therefore this leads to other kinds of inequalities, like men being able to earn on average more than women doing the same jobs, etc., etc., all the kinds of wage gap debates that we've had. And this is really where societal inequalities come from, according to feminists. Now, this is not to say that all feminists believe that it is all based around gender and men versus women and the kind of things that exist around that, but it is just to suggest that a large amount of social and societal inequalities exist along this axis. And this actually brings into an interesting discussion about a theory known as intersectionality. And I'm going to bring this up quite a lot when we're talking about sociology and the way in which our society is structured through different institutions like education and religion, etc. And intersectionality refers to the idea that societal inequalities can exist and they can intersect with each other. So, for example, we can already work out and we can understand, generally speaking, that there exists a number of different kinds of societal inequalities. Okay, so there will be societal inequalities based on race, so we can have racial inequalities. We can also have, again, sex or gender, so sex and gender, which are obviously not the same thing, which we'll look at in a separate chapter. We also have age. Age tends to, and then we also have sexual orientation. So sexual orientation. And the idea behind intersectionality and intersectional theory is that these kinds of societal inequalities, and there are probably other ones that I've not mentioned here, can actually intersect with each other to bring about more inequality for some individuals. So, for example, if you're a person of colour, then that will probably mean that you are suffering from racial inequality. But if you're also a female of colour who is also a gay person of colour and also maybe even young, then all of these different societal inequalities will intersect with each other, and we have here this centre here where the people who are suffering the most kinds of societal inequalities exist. And it's always important to remember intersectional theory and intersectionality when it comes to looking at societal inequalities, because when people make arguments based on gender and sex, like with most feminist theories, or possibly class and class inequalities like a Marxist theory would, they need to take into account issues relating to intersectionality. And this is something that we will look at later on as lessons go on and go on. We should also note that feminism is a structuralist theory. It's a structuralist theory just like functionalism. So just like functionalism. Just like functionalism. And again, just like with functionalism, it's a structuralist theory because it looks at the ways in which society is structured. It looks at the structures and the fundamental building blocks of societies, looks at these social inequalities, and then uses different kinds of feminist theory and sociological theory to come to some kind of answers as to why these societal inequalities exist. And they believe that this is based mainly on sex discrimination. Now, there are lots of different types of feminists, and we're going to look at three main ones here. So, for the most part, feminism tends to exist in the form of what we would describe as liberal feminism. And this is just the general belief that men and women ought to be equal within society. There ought to be an amount of equality within society. And this means a push for equal rights and opportunities is important within a liberal feminist framework. And according to a liberal feminist, the best way to bring about these kinds of societal equalities is to introduce opportunities for women in societal structures. So we're talking about, for example, a number of issues when it comes to women in business, for example, or women in law, or even women in politics. So if we look at the higher echelons of these kinds of industries, or these kinds of areas of work, business being people who are at the top of their business, people in law being, at the very top of the legal profession, whether that be advocacy or even through the judiciary, and people in politics at the very top, so people like legislators in parliament. To what extent could we argue that women are underrepresented in these areas? And it is definitely true that they are definitely underrepresented in these areas. Okay, and it makes sense that new opportunities for women to strive for these kinds of high-level areas of business, law, politics, or even STEM, for example, science and engineering and maths, and there are plenty of other examples. That's what liberal feminism seeks to achieve, and this is an example of the kind of opportunities that a number of liberal feminists would be pushing for to try and close this inequality between men and women in the very tops of these professions. Radical feminism, on the other hand, exists in a separate dimension. Okay. And as the name suggests, radical feminism is more radical than liberal feminism. It is the argument that society is structured in such a way as to oppress women. So whereas a liberal feminist believes that there ought to be equality, and that there might be a number of underlying reasons why there isn't equality, like, for example, historical inequality, that can then, transgress throughout the years and still cause problems today. Radical feminists argue that it's actually society itself, the structure of society itself, that is set up in a way to oppress women. And in order for this oppression to end, there needs to be a change wholesale in society itself, in the structure of society. Now, some radical feminists argue that it's structured deliberately in a way to oppress women, and more moderate radical feminists would argue that it's structured in a way to oppress women, and that's just the way that it is structured. There's no underlying plot beyond that. And it's suggested within radical feminism that all relationships between individuals, between a man and a woman, creates a power imbalance. And this power imbalance exists in favour of men and against women. And this is not just any kind of relationship, business relationships, okay, any kind of constructural relationships that exists. The final one I'll talk about is a mixture between our previously discussed lesson on Marxism and this lesson here on feminism, and that is to look at Marxist feminism. And this incorporates a lot of Marxist theory through the lens of feminism. So we take the feminist lens of analysis through their sociological lens of analysis, and we apply some Marxist principles there as well. And we're going to look at this more and more as we go through the different chapters. But one key takeaway from the beginning is that a Marxist feminist would argue that women are exploited by the capitalist system. So they add another dimension, they add another factor into this system of exploitation and this system of coercion. They argue that capitalism is one of the key motivating factors that brings about this sex discrimination and this gender inequality. And as such, according through a Marxist feminism lens and a Marxist lens more generally, an end to capitalism, a bringing about of the end of capitalism is the best way to change this nature of exploitation.